Right. Thank you for being here today, despite the heavy rain this morning. And then I also would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for supporting this symposium and also RIBiLT and our school. Right. So the talk of today is quite simple from my perspective. I would say the research questions I'm going to address is very straightforward. Can we speak two languages to autistic children? And I'm going to share the evidence from Cantonese English bilingual children with autism spectrum disorder. Now, thanks to Professor Su and Professor Kang, I don't need to explain what is autism, right? And then we can see that there are a lot of challenges for autistic children in the field. There's language development, delays, and difficulties in different aspects of linguistic pragmatics, prosody, and sometimes morphosyntax. Now, in addition to language development, autistic children also find executive functions, including working memory, inhibit control, and set shifting quite challenging. Now, despite these challenges, autistic children are living in a globalized world, right? So there are more than 50% of the world population are bilingual. So it seems like bilingual is a norm of the world, and then you can't avoid bilingualism given the situation. So the concern here is this bilingual exposure give extra burden for the language and executive functions in autistic children. But surprisingly, there's a very limited study on bilingualism's effect or impact on the language and then executive function in autistic children. So now let's look at what we know about bilingualism and ASD. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between bilingual and ASD in terms of language first, and then we'll move to executive function. So for typical developing children, it's well established that being bilingual does not harm your language development. You can still develop two separate language systems, right? But for ASD, it's relatively unknown. It's an emerging research area, but we still are very not sure how bilingualism affects the language development. Now, in the past 10 years, researchers found out bilingualism has no negative effect on language skills on autistic children, including vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, expressive vocabulary, syntax, sentence repetition, and functional communication. And some study found like there might be some potential advantage that is bilingual children, they may outperform the monolingual autistic peers for example, in total vocabulary size, verbal fluency, and narrative production. Now, in terms of executive function, I think there's still debate on whether there is bilingual advantage, right? So some people claim that bilingual advantage can be boosted. Bilingualism can boost executive functions, inhibit control, set shifting, and working memory, etc. But there's also some non-findings. And then people suggest that that might be related to task or the socioeconomic status or the language pairs that the research are comparing. Now, in terms of the autistic children, most of the current research are based on the parent report or direct assessment. So most of them are based on the parent report and less related to direct assessment. So the findings so far are very mixed. So for example, in set shifting, working memory, and inhibit control, there are some advantages found in autistic children being bilingual, but there are also some non-findings. Now, let's get back to the autistic children in Hong Kong. So the estimated ASD preference in Hong Kong is about 2.5 or 2.6%, according to a very recent study. And then the bilingual context in Hong Kong is also quite interesting. We have Cantonese as our one, which is a societal language, and English as our two, the non-societal language, or let's say for children's perspective, it's the weak language. And the Mandarin, for most of the children in Hong Kong, they are our three. So being bilingual is unavoidable for children in Hong Kong. So sometimes like reviewers always ask like, you don't have the monolingual group in your manuscript. So we probably want to address the question is, it's very difficult to find true monolinguals in Hong Kong. So which makes the control group very, very difficult. And then another question is, can the previous findings, which you can see are mostly done in Western countries, and then they're comparing two typologically similar language, like for example, Spanish and English in Canada and in the US. So whether these findings can be generalized to Cantonese English autistic children, because we know Cantonese English are very different, right? Typologically, genetically. Now I'm going to talk about two studies. The first study is focusing on the bilingualism effect on L1 of autistic children. So basically speaking, does being bilingual affect the L1 development of the autistic children? And then in the second study, we're going to talk about the bilingualism effect on executive functions. So what is focus? I think Professor Tang has mentioned what is focus yesterday, so I don't need to go in details, but here I would like to go through them very briefly. Here you can see that to the question, the rabbit is eating the carrot, to the question, who is eating the carrot? So we'll say it's a new information, right? And then the focus, so this is, the focus can be new information, or let's say broad focus. And then the focus can be contrastive. For example, is the rabbit in sentence 2, is the rabbit eating the carrot? The answer is no, the fox is eating the carrot. Now, why we study focus here? Because comprehension of focus is quite crucial for communication. It's a key information structure, right? And then in order to understand this question and to continue the conversation, the interlocutors need to distinguish the old information, for example, the rabbit in the previous context, and also a set of alternatives, right? So it can be the fox, it can be the duck, to respond accordingly, which is quite difficult for children. And then the current study will focus on contrast focus. Now in Cantonese, it can be marked syntactically or prosodically, or both. So for example, the question is, does a dog pack the school bag? And then the answer is no. 係貓貓隻書包, which means 係 is the focus particle here. And then you can also use prosody to mark focus, right? For example, 唔係貓貓隻書包. Or you can use both, right? So you can put focus particle before the focus, and then you can also put prosody prominence on the focus. Now, in terms of the prosodically marked focus in autistic children, previous found that autistic children have difficulties with placing the contrastive accent to mark focus correctly in the context. And in terms of syntactically marked focus, we also found that the autistic children perform significantly worse than the typically developing children in using the morphosyntax to produce focus. But all the studies are related to monolingual children, and we don't know how that could be for bilingual children. So the first question is, we want to know how do monolingual and bilingual autistic children use syntax or prosody to produce focus in Cantonese? So we'll measure their accuracy rate. And then for the second question, we'll ask, how does bilingual exposure impact the focus production of these Cantonese English bilingual autistic children's first language, which is Cantonese? We have 46 autistic children between the age of 5 to 9. And then they have Cantonese as L1, English as L2 before age 3. And then we have the comparison group as TD, 55 numbers of typically developing children. Now, in order to divide the participants into bilingual and monolingual group, we adopt this standard is if the time-life ratio of the dominant language in the sequential bilingual is approximately 88%, and then we would define them as bilingual versus monolingual. So children in our study was considered as bilingual if their English exposure is over 12% of the total language input, which is around like 13.5 hours English exposure per week. So here is the procedure. So we first ask the parents to fill in the consent form, of course, and then the language background questionnaire. So in the questionnaire, we ask parents to fill in the language exposure, which is Cantonese, English, and also Mandarin, in different settings, in the home setting, in the school setting, in the community setting. And then we ask the participants, the children, to complete nonverbal IQ, Cantonese receptive vocabulary, and also working memory content in digital span. And then for ASD children, we also conduct those too. Now in step 3, all the children will have the production experiment. So here is the demographic information. So you can see that all the groups are matched in maternal education, nonverbal IQ, working memory, CRVT, and then ASD, monolingual, and bilingual. They are matched in 802 score. But we can see that the ASD groups and then the TD groups are not matched in age. So ASD are significantly older than the typically developing children. Now here is the production experiment. So we have two experimenters. So the experimenter A will show the child the picture on the right. So you can see it's a cat packing the school bag. And then she described the picture in a paired SVO sentence. So it's like, look at the picture describes 猫猫在书包, so the cat packs the school bag. And then the child will be asked to remember the sentence before they start the experiment. And then experiment B will pretend that he cannot see the picture and then start asking what's in the picture. So we hope like the child will describe the picture first so we can generate a broad focus. And then the experiment B will ask the child and then she will replace the subject. She will say, oh, you said 狗狗在书包, and then we're hoping that the child will correct experimenter B, right? And say, no, 猫猫在书包. So the child can use can use sentence particle to mark focus. They can also use prosody to mark focus. It's a 4x4 design. We have 4 groups: ASD monolingual, ASD bilingual, TD monolingual, TD bilingual. And we also have focus positions. We have in different positions, broad focus as a baseline, subject, verb focus, and the object focus. We also control the tone. For example, here you can see 猫猫在书包. So all the words are in tone 1. So we have tone 1, tone 3, and tone 4. Now, each child will complete a list of 9 experimental items in 3 different tones and 2 practice items. And then we record the answer for analysis. So here today, I'm going to report some judgment data. So 2 native speakers of Cantonese with linguistic training, they judge all the utterance produced by the children. So unclear utterance, incomplete utterance were excluded. And then we call the accuracy rate for each utterance. And then the inter-rate reliability was around like 95% agreement. So here you can see the result in terms of the accuracy of focus production in 4 groups in 4 focus conditions. There's no effect. There's no main effect of tone, so we didn't present the tone here. So for broad focus and then verb focus, there's no group difference and there's no interaction difference as well, interaction effects as well. But for the subject focus, you can see that the ASD bilingual are significantly lower than the ASD, for the TD bilingual. And there's also significant difference between the ASD monolingual and the TD bilingual. Now for the object focus, which is quite interesting, ASD monolingual, the accuracy rate is significantly higher than TD bilingual and TD monolingual. But interestingly, there's no difference between ASD bilingual and TD bilingual or TD monolingual in terms of the accuracy rate in object focus. And ASD bilingual has a higher accuracy rate than the ASC monolingual in object focus. Now, let's look at the bilingual exposure in ASC and TD. So for Cantonese exposure, we can see that the four groups only differ for TD monolingual. So TD monolingual receive the most Cantonese Cantonese input as a total. For English input, ASC monolingual does not differ from TD monolingual, but you can see that ASC bilingual have significantly less English exposure compared to TD bilingual. Now, what's the relationship between the bilingualism effect on the accuracy? We find, even so, you can see that sometimes the accuracy rate is like increasing or decreasing, but there's no significant correlation between English exposure and the production accuracy in both groups. So it seems like there's no effect of the English exposure on the accuracy rate of the focus production in both groups. So let's get back to the two research questions. So the first one is, how do monolingual and bilingual autistic children use syntax and prosody to produce focus in Cantonese? We found that for ASD monolinguals, right? So they are very similar to TD bilingual and TD monolingual. And then for the subject and object focus, ASD monolingual perform worse than the TD pairs. So it aligns with the previous study that focus production is difficult, right, for autistic children. But for ASC bilinguals, we found that they are very similar, or they are aligned with typically developing children in broad, verb, and object focus. And then for the subject focus, ASD are performing worse than the TD. And then if we compare ASC monolingual and the ASC bilingual, surprisingly, you find that ASC monolingual are performing worse than ASC bilingual. Or in other way, ASC bilingual outperform ASC monolingual in object focus production. Now, for the second research question, how does bilingual exposure impact the focus production? So we found that first, bilingual children or bilingual autistic children in Hong Kong, they are exposed to a similar amount of Cantonese input, but they are significantly less than English. And the English exposure is not related to the accuracy of focus production in autistic children. So, and then bilingual autistic children compared to the monolingual autistic children, they're even better in terms of the object focus. So let's get back to the discussion. So we will say this is the first investigation of the bilingualism effect on the language acquisition of autistic children in Cantonese English bilingual context. And then we found that bilingual autistic children, they are not experiencing additional language difficulties compared to autistic monolingual children. And then sometimes they even perform better, for example, the object focus production. Right. Now, we have seen the bilingualism effect on language. So how about the effects on executive function? So this study is collaborated with Cai Cai and Ruofan, and we just presented the result in ISB. Now, for this study, we can, I don't think we need to go through the bilingual context in Hong Kong again, but what I'm going to mention here is the most settings in Hong Kong is conducted in one language, right? So there's, for example, in the school setting, in the classroom setting, it's English as an instructional language, or outside of the class, students or the children will mainly talk in Cantonese or in their dominant language. So very unlikely that they need to set shifting just in one setting. So that's why in this study, we focus on the working memory and inhibit control instead of the three key components of executive functions. So we look at whether there's any difference in working memory and inhibit controls between bilingual autistic and bilingual TD children. And then we also want to look at the effect of bilingual exposure. We have 86 Cantonese English sequential bilingual children at age of 5 to 9, and then autistic children has we have 46 autistic children and 40 typically developing children. Now, different from the study one, where we divide the children into monolingual and a bilingual group, we treat children here just as bilingual group, which means we treat bilingualism as a continuous variable instead of categorical like distinction. I think this is kind of like the trend in the field of bilingualism. They see because especially like in Hong Kong, we even though the exposure is there, but the degree of bilingualism is quite different, right? So treating bilingualism as a continuous variable can reflect its dynamic nature. Now we do the screening with those 2, and then 10 autistic children were excluded. Now for executive function tasks, we conduct working memory by backward digital span, and then inhibit control by frank task. We also we also ask the parents to fill in a very similar questionnaire, like Cantonese exposure at school, home school, and community setting, English exposure at different settings. And then we control their age, nonverbal IQ, and SES. So here is the demographic information of the children at the 2 groups. You can see that they are matched in age, in nonverbal IQ, AOA, age of acquisition of English, but they are not matched in socio-economic status. So here is the bilingual exposure in ASD, very similar to the study 1. Cantonese exposure very similar, but English exposure, you can see ASD received very significantly less English exposure than the typically developing children, especially in the school setting and the total. Now, here is a result of the working memory and inhibit control. For working memory, no significant difference between the 2 groups, even we control the age, nonverbal IQ, SES. But for inhibit control, you can see that in terms of the frank effect ACC, no significant group difference. But for the RT, we see significant group difference, which means ASD are performing worse than the TD. Now, what's the relationship between bilingual exposure versus with working memory and the inhibit control? So here is the relationship between working memory and then bilingual exposure. You can see that Cantonese home total, and only Cantonese home total, predict great working memory in ASD, but not in TD. And we didn't find any other significant predictors here. Now, inhibit control are very similar patterns. Cantonese home total predict smaller frank effect. So smaller frank effect means higher inhibit control, right? And in ASD, but not in TD. Surprisingly, we found that Cantonese school total predict larger frank effect in ACC, which means they have lower inhibit control, which is quite interesting. And this pattern is found in ASD, but not in TD as well. Now, inhibit frank effect in reaction time, the result is also very consistent to the ACC, to accuracy rate. We can see that more Cantonese home total predicts smaller frank effect in RT, in ASD, but not in TD. Now, you might find this quite interesting, whether more English exposure will have, let's say, predict greater frank effect. But there's a significantly obvious outlier. And then if we remove this point, the significant effect was gone. Now let's get back to the question. So is there any difference in working memory and inhibit control between the bilingual autistic and the bilingual TD children? Now in terms of, for working memory, we see the 2 groups are very similar, right? We suspect that maybe this task is challenging for both groups. So that's why even for TD children, they are performing not as good as we expected. And then for inhibit control, we found autistic children perform worse than typically developing children. That might be the case that maybe inhibit control is developing ahead, right? So this is an easier or like cognitive component to develop. And that might also be another explanation is the nature of the task, because we know in working memory, we ask the children to do backward digital span. So they need to recite the numbers, which is a verbal task. But in inhibit control, we just ask the kids to press the buttons, which requires no verbal requirement. Now, let's get back to the second research question. How does bilingual exposure affect the working memory and inhibit control in bilingual autistic children? So for working memory, higher Cantonese home exposure will predict greater working memory in ASD but not in TD. And in inhibit control, we found that higher Cantonese home exposure also predict higher inhibit control in ASD but not in TD. And surprisingly, we found higher Cantonese school exposure will predict lower inhibit control in ASD but not in TD. And in terms of the reaction time, higher Cantonese home exposure predict higher inhibit control in ASD but not in TD. So the conclusion here is we didn't find any negative impact from L2, from English, on autistic children's executive function, working memory, or inhibit control. But for Cantonese exposure, it really matters, particularly for autistic children. So more Cantonese exposure at home will enhance the inhibit control and the working memory in our study. Now, what is the practical implications from these two studies? I think the take-home message is: don't worry, you can speak to parents and clinicians can speak two languages to autistic children because we didn't find any negative effect, right? And then in my first study, we also see some positive effect. Bilingual autistic children outperform monolingual autistic children. And if that is the case, we might consider to include more bilingual program to support the families to raise bilingual autistic children in the bilingual community. Okay, so finally, I would like to acknowledge the grants and also Haoyan Society for helping recruit the participants, and then my research assistant, Arlene and Xiangyu, and the student trainee, and then most importantly, for the children and the family for participating in this study, in these two studies. Okay, thank you very much, and then I'm happy to take questions.
Thank the organizer for this wonderful event. It's a great opportunity for me to learn from experts dedicating to this field for years. For me, I'm just I work on phonetics and speech acquisition mainly by adults. It's only just in recent years that I started to get a peek through the windows or through the doors into this field. So when after the first day of listening to all these wonderful talks, and then I re-looked at my presentation, I think it's best more appropriate to add this word reflection on what I have done and what we actually are planning to do and the preparations that we are still working on. So because when I submitted this title months ago, I was quite ambitious and a little bit too bold, thought that I could make some progresses, but it's really slow. So today I'm only going to share what we did and what we are planning to do next. Right. Right, so I'm going to start talking about our studies, some previous studies on perception, speech perception with children with speech sound disorders, and also starting from speech perception, moving into the some attempts on articulation. Right, just to say that some of the data and findings were from this previous papers. I left out many details. If you want to know more, you can look at this, try find these papers for details. All right, so when I say speech disorders, I was actually referring to this particular type, the speech sound disorders. And also there are a variety of subtypes under speech sound disorder. In my study that in a collaboration with speech therapists, we're actually focusing on just one specific type of this speech sound disorder, that is the functional ones. That is the children show persistent speech errors, but without any particular or diagnosed organic impairments. So there has been studies over the past decades or so on the cause behind such kind of speech disorder, sound disorder, there could be genetic, neurobiological, and well, for me, I'm more interested in this exploration that proposes, hypothesizing that behind this kind of functional speech sound disorder, there could be a linguistic explanation. So they have problems, issues, challenges in speech production. So there could be, is it possible that their production, difficulties in production may be motivated or influenced by their problems in speech perception. And so that's what motivated us to collaborate with, not actually collaborate, but rather when we were given these questions by the speech therapist, they asked us if we could help them with this group of children who had this disorder. They asked us if we could help them design some speech materials, help them to figure out what's going on with this, since there's unknown causes. Okay. So that's also kind of quite challenging to us, because there are so many types of, right, so many different types of speech errors behind there. And also, in order to understand the relationship between speech perception and production, well, also, even in phonetic studies, it's a classic topic, try to find out the link between speech perception and speech production. And among this literature, in our literature review of speech sound disorder, we found that, well, here, this is a paper in 1997. They say there's already been 80 years trying to figure out the link in there among SSD children. Well, I guess by now we should say there's over 100 years that people have been working to figure out this link there. Well, ever since in the 1930s, people have already noticed that, I think, forgot if, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a writer, maybe a therapist or a scientist suggesting that working on speech production errors, we may also need to pay attention to train the children to their ear training, to train or enhance their awareness of perception, right? So no matter whether it's phonetic studies or in the literature of SSD, people generally agree there is a strong connection between perception and production, or at least there is this kind of we say indirect connection there. And not only in the typically developing population, but also with this SSD population, as Professor Zhang Xinda proved with his empirical studies. Well, in here on over there, here, this is a diagram that we found from Professor Zhang's study in 2000 with this testing, trying to showing us, illustrate this connection, or not connection, I want to say that how this perception of discrimination of speech sound contrast may precede speech production here. So this is a 75% accuracy rate and in speech perception, and this is for speech production. So here's 3 years old, and this is 6-year-old. So in general, this is in conformity with how in phonetics we understand the relationship between perception and production. So perception precedes production. If one cannot produce a sound accurately, there's very likely that one may not be able to perceive these sounds very well. So that's basically what motivates us in the in our study in trying to figure out what happens with these perceptual skills among these children with SSD. So when from right, and from this, when we examine these children with SSD, we'll say that if we cannot produce this sound contrast or specific speech sounds well, there are two possible case scenarios. One is that they may not have yet established very clear phonological categories for these speech sounds involved. Could also be possible that they may have some kind of clear category. However, they may not be able to hold contrast of this particular category with others. So there are two kind of possibilities there. And for each of these kind of hypotheses, we could find some phonetic methods or approach, try to figure out the answers behind that. So for the first kind of scenario, if there is not yet well-defined phonological categories, we could try to use phonetic methods, that is to test their identification. If we can identify a particular sound that seems to belong to a particular category. And for the second scenario, if we have we may have some clear or intact categories, then we need to test if we could tell the difference between elements or members from from the same or from different categories. And so for that, we could try to use discrimination task or discrimination diagram to work on that. And putting identification and discrimination together, this actually is a very classic paradigm in phonetic studies. That's the categorical perception paradigm. So in this under this paradigm, we could use natural stimuli, stimuli that produced by people, but we could also use the synthesized stimuli that try to examine more fine details, specific cues that contribute to the distinction of phonetics of speech sounds. Right. So once we settled on these methods, on this categorical perception paradigm, next is we wanted to see, well, there are plenty of types of speech errors that children with SSD may have. Well, I'm just listing here. This is just a list giving us this kind of development trend of 普通话 consonants. Okay. Among these consonants, we picked out one particular type or two particular sounds. That's the alveolar plosive and the velar plosive. Well, the velar sound, as I circled out here, is acquired much early, before 2-year-old. The g sound, okay, the g sound is quite much earlier on. And then this velar sound, the g and the k, is acquired before 4-year-old. So they are not very typical, not difficult, challenging sounds for children. Okay? However, for those of you who have experience with young kids, you probably have heard of your children or children around you saying something, instead of saying 哥哥, they may say 的的. Instead of saying 姑姑, they say 嘟嘟. Okay? So it's a very typical phenomenon or processing that we can observe among even typically developing children. And in phonetics or phonology, we call it fronting. That is to change velar sounds into an alveolar sound. Okay? So in terms of the position of our tongue is putting forward, so we call it fronting. All right. So the reason why we pick this pair of contrasts is that it's quite exceptional in a sense that these two sounds, the two speech sounds involved, are acquired much early on. And this so-called fronting is also common among typically developing children. But children, these TD children, can very soon outgrow this kind of, we say, if you want to say, called wrong phonological realization. But children with SSD, it seems that this fronting is quite persistent, okay, quite persistent, because we call it an error. And there's also more about this fronting, using this is alveolar to replace this velar sound. There seems to be a language universal pattern in terms of the position. So like even for English, which allows this contrast at syllable initial, middle, and final positions, you will not find such kind of substitution at syllable final position, but only at syllable initial position. Okay? So, well, another thing is that because there are still like as in other cases in functional speech disorder, the reason behind it is still unknown. Why children with SSD may substitute an alveolar sound with a velar sound. They are both much acquired much earlier on, not challenging sounds at all, not like the affricates sounds or retroflex sounds. They're easy, but still we found such substitution. So we picked this particular pair to start with, the hope that, because we reviewed the literature and found there's really a scarce of perceptual data. And we hope that we could help these therapists to try to establish some kind of normative perceptual data. And later on, hopefully, they could also build more effective training materials based on the perceptual findings. Right. Oh, right. There's another thing that I want to mention. This is what I found from Taobao on the internet. So it's based on we spent months observing and following the therapist in their clinics, how they train, how they diagnose, and how they train this young children with SSD. And we found that when they try to when they in their therapeutic sessions, when they try to show the children how to produce a vela sound, they really use this little spatula gadget there. They gently push the tip of the tongue to the back. Okay, when we do this, you see, you cannot avoid raising the back of your tongue. That would be an expected articulatory gesture for vela sounds. Because you can imagine, you can't tell a child that you have to raise the back of your tongue for this particular g sound. They don't understand what is happening. So instead of doing that, they just gently push their tongue tip to the back. And when you raise the back of your tongue, it's also very natural. You have to lower the tip of your tongue. That would be a very good articulatory position for a vela sound. So that's what I observed. When I asked the therapist why you do this and how do you know this kind of thing, they say that this works. It's passed down from other therapists. So it's they really need, they're in bad need of these more well-informed practices or well-informed design of materials. So see, they understand very well about this kind of articulation, from practice. But behind that, how children understand, whether children truly understand the difference between a t sound, between a d sound and a g sound is still unknown. So that's what we wanted to wanted to start with. Right. So we pick this d and k contrast, and as I mentioned, that when we adopt a categorical perception paradigm, we could use naturally produced stimuli. Okay? But in this, among these children with SSD, it's very clear that they have problem with this naturally produced sounds already. So for us as a phonetician, we wanted to say that we want to try to simplify the situation by focusing on the most relevant and critical phonetic cues that can contribute to the distinction of the two sounds. Well, this is a diagram illustrating that from in the 1950s that scientists have already shown that with just the first two formants of a syllable that we could generate very satisfactorily this ga, da, and a ba, a place of articulation. So ba from the top panel is b, ba, 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 with a bilabial plosive and alveolar and velar plosive. So we don't need all the fine details, every piece of the details of phonetic issue, but just these first two form and frequency that gives us the idea of the resident nature of the oral cavity, then we can generate a very good d and g sound. Well, also you can see here in this diagram, when we change the vowel context, the trajectories of these form and frequencies also change. So out of this consideration for our own work, okay, we picked this one particular context, vowel context, ga sound, the da and the ga in 普通话. Okay, because the synthesis is, relatively speaking, easier than when we try to synthesize it from gi, because there's not a legitimate syllable, and also from a group sound. Right. So a very good g sound, a very good g F2 may start with maybe as high as 2000 hertz, and also a very good da sound may start with F2 starts with 1600. That's where we started. So we synthesized a continuum for categorical perception. We synthesized this paradigm from da to ga sound. Okay. All right, so you know what, I'm going to play you this continuum we generated. So what you see here is that we used a stepwise method to change the onset of the F2 from 1600 to 2600 in 9 steps, and we generated it all together. There will be 10 stimuli, which would serve for identification and discrimination. All right, so let me see if I can play them. Oh, yeah, I can do this.
Da 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 da.
Right, one more time. So starting from da, that's a naturally produced da sound. Da, as in da che, da, and all the way to ga ga ga, as if the sound of a little duck.
Da 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 da.
So this is what the children listened to in our study. Okay, so we generate this stimuli and then pair them up in 6 blocks for discrimination, and also randomize playing them in 6 blocks for identification. And then we, as we mentioned, that we all know that to work with young children, we really need some kind of innovation. You can't ask them, okay, did you hear a da sound or did you hear a g sound? But they wouldn't understand what is happening. So before we start this experiment, we actually tried, the therapists together, we designed a little game for them. So we use this pictures, if you can see here, a little duck, a toy, and saying to them, okay, this is a little duck, you know, this is little duck, what does a little duck say? Okay, and that's the sound you want to know. And then we also, they play this, how do we say, building blocks. And we play these building blocks with them and telling them, okay, you put one piece on the other, that is da ji mu, okay, the da. So after several sessions, they started to establish the connection between, at least we thought, okay, we assume that they have established this connection between the sound and the meaning or the picture. Then we started to do this experiment, playing the sound, ask them to press the button, whether it's 大积木的大 or 小鸭子嘎嘎叫的嘎, okay? And then do this kind of identification. While for discrimination, it's easier. We play 2 sounds at a time and ask them if you think these 2 sounds are the same or different. And also with practical, with trials, to make sure that we understand what we ask them to do. All right. So, well, this is a very small scale study, and I should say I'm very grateful for the therapists and doctors in this study, because I told them you need to be very cautious selecting, try to avoid any variables. When you select, you have to be strict, things like this. So they spent months to find these 15 children, okay, and then all the experiments were conducted in Foshan Changcheng Yuan. So they helped us did all these screening and diagnosis and make sure that these 15 children are all show persistent fronting issue in their speech production, and there's no other intervening variables in there. And we also have 10 age-matched children and also age between 4 to 5. If you remember, just in the beginning, I showed you that figure from Professor Zhang's study where there is actually that TD contrast there too. The TD contrast between the children, typically developing children can tell TD contrast very well at the age of 3, but they can only achieve this 70% accuracy rate in production after 6 years old. Not after, sorry, around 6, much later than that. So we found these children between 4 to 5 years old. And here's the results. So they listen to one, they try to identify whether it's da or ga, and also they try to listen to da-ga pairs, telling whether it's same or different. Also on the left here are the results from adults, typically developed adults, and these are typically developing children. On the right is from these children with SSD. And so we say that adults and children, TD children, they show very similar pattern in sound identification. Okay? Identification. So here, what you see here are the different stimuli. We generate 10, okay? 9 stimuli. Okay? And this is the accurate response percentage. Wouldn't say accuracy, but their response rate. They start solid line indicating their responses to ga sounds, and the dotted line represented da sound. Okay, so they show a very typical at a certain stage when you listen to that diagram, continuum, you hear that somewhere along the continuum there's a change from da to ga. Okay, so adults would say that at the stimuli 5, when we listen to this number 5, you hear a change, somewhat change in there. But for children with SSD, very clearly, they have very different, distinctly different patterns in identification. They have a somewhat, I think it's around 60%. They seem to prefer the ga sound when listening. But remember, they always substitute the ga sound with the da sound. But in our continuum, somehow they show this, I wouldn't say a preference, but somewhat slight preference to ga sound. But actually, in nature, they couldn't tell. They don't have actually a clear category of ga or da, as this pattern shows. And in here are the results from discrimination. When they heard 2 sounds, a pair of sounds, whether they can tell it's different or the same. We have both the same pair and different pairs. And here we converted all into the hit rates. Okay. So here again, these solid lines and these dotted lines are from adults and typically developing children. So these 2 groups show resemblance with each other as expected. But the children with this SSD in here, basically they cannot tell from this sound. All the pairs, all the sounds in each pair sounds the same to them. So in the beginning, we say whether they have, we ask whether they have a clear defined phonological category or whether they have a category, but just could not tell the sounds apart within the category or between the categories. So our results here seems to suggest that they don't have yet a clear category of de and ge. And of course, they could not tell sounds within the pair or within a category or across the category. So this might be some of the reasons why they could not produce the de and ke sound well. Their question still remains is why they are using de to replace ge instead of other speech sound. So for that, we have not yet figured out how to work on that. But at least the first step is here that we answer the question, what about their perceptual scales where they cannot produce the sounds well? Okay. So this is our first step. And originally we hoped that we could start with this exceptional case and gradually move on to more consonant pairs and more, and also vowels, and also, of course, the tone pairs in Putonghua. But once we started to look into this, try to design more speech stimuli, we started to find that we are actually, it seems that we're digging quite a big hole for ourselves, making it very difficult for us because in the literature we found that we understand this perception is crucial, speech perception is crucial, but there are both, we look even further, we notice there are both we say innate capacities and also learned capacities when it comes to the perceptual distinction of speech sounds. Okay? We understand they are both, how to say, knowledge that we gained from our first language, but also there are some natural properties embedded in speech sound that makes some perception more challenging than others. Okay, we call it perceptual asymmetry. Okay? So there's both linguistic and non-linguistic factors behind this kind of perceptual asymmetry or imbalance that we notice. So for example, a well-known phenomenon of speech perception is found in vowels. A polka and a bond, they have they are the leading phoneticians that found that when native speakers of English listen to vowels in pairs, their discrimination is much better when when the speech order goes from a less peripheral to a more peripheral vowel. That is peripheral vowels. If you imagine this vowel trapezium, the E, A, U, these sounds occur around the corner of our vowel spaces, and they're called peripheral vowels. So the other ones may be considered as less peripheral. But if you give them a pair from, for example, E to E, okay, their discriminations can be really good, but not much better than the other way around, from E to E. Okay? So there is, this holds true not only among adults, but also among even infants. Okay? And also for consonants, not only for vowels, but also for consonants among native speakers, they have noticed that the VOT, I mean, yesterday Professor Lee talked about the VOT. They've noticed that even for VOT strings, continuum of VOTs, the aspirated sounds are more noticeable among this unaspirated sound than the other way around. So it seems that our auditory system is more sensitive to certain kind of sounds or certain group of phonetic properties than others. And also, not only for this, we say that in linguistics, this is these are all VOTs, or this formula frequencies are all very critical, but also for nasal, this nasality or nasillance. These people's attention in studies on phonetic convergence, they found that when the degree of nasality changes, people's tendency to do phonetic convergence also change. So it seems that we have this kind of different degrees of sensitivity to speech sounds. But when it comes to tones, we found that there's mixed results. No agreement on which tones or which direction order may contribute to the better or worse discrimination of tones among even native speakers. So that's where we step in, and we always think we could also work a little bit on that. And this also relates with my own experience. Actually started with when I tried to learn Cantonese tones. I found it's really challenging for me. I could theoretically produce this sound CCC, but I don't know which one actually I'm producing. So when I listen to these sounds, well, we understand that Cantonese sounds may also differ in terms of the average F0s or onset of zeros. That's different from a Mandarin tone contrast. So we say that, okay, let's try to, first of all, try to figure out what happens among us adults, okay, among us learning the first language or those speaking Cantonese at the second. Okay. So this is actually a study from Zhang who also turned this into her PhD dissertation. So we picked out two pairs of Cantonese tones. One is the rising tone. We have a C and a C. And these two rising tones that ends at different degrees of F0 offset. And we also have this, I picked these two level tones, C, C. I hope that I produced that well. And as a contrast, we also select two falling tones. So there are different slopes, okay? Different slopes of the tone. So we have rising, level, and falling tone pairs. We want to see that if when Cantonese native speakers, Cantonese and Mandarin speakers who don't know much about Cantonese and also non-tone languages speakers like English, when they listen to the tones, would they also perceive the tones as the same, or would there be asymmetry patterns as people may have suggested in the literature? So we use naturally produced tones in the pair to form discrimination tests. That is, people listen to a pair of tones, try to tell, well, it's the same or different. So imagine that if you are a native speaker of Cantonese, you may thought it's, well, it's a piece of cake, easy. I can tell the sounds apart of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to I couldn't be called as a native speaker, right? However, now let's see here. Let's try to listen to these pairs of tones and see if you can tell the difference between the tones in each pair and how easy that job is for you. So the first two, I've already gave you the order. Remember, just now I mentioned that in vowels, perception of vowels, there is a very strong effect of presentation order. And in tones, we also noticed similar things.
C, 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 C.
Okay, one more time. So these same tone, same two tones, but in different orders.
C, 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 C.
This is actually the pair that I listened to when before we started this. For me, I find that, I'm not quite sure if you share the same feeling. For me, the second pair, C, C, sounds very different to me, much more than the first kind, C, C. So that got into I just thinking, what is happening here? Why? I'm not a good speaker of Cantonese, so we also asked the native speakers of Cantonese to try that, and they reported the same feeling to us. And not only that, but we also tried to see if this pair level tones show the same pattern.
C, 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 C.
So this is level tone. And we also have a control pair. So we wanted to know if the direction of pitch change would make a difference here.
炸，炸，炸，炸。
All right, so these are the stimuli that we prepared for people to listen, try to tell whether they hear a difference. These are the results. Well, as we had expected that all three groups, Cantonese native speakers, Mandarin speakers who didn't know much about Cantonese, and also English speakers who don't know tonal languages, we all find that their hit rates, which converted their responses into hit rates because we have both same pair and different pairs. So in general, we find that falling tones are much easier. Go quickly. So this is the results for final falling tones. We are all very good with that. No problem. People can, no matter which order we use, we all tell them apart very well. And for level tones, things getting a little bit interesting. And this is the most interesting pattern we found that even for Cantonese speakers, native speakers of Cantonese, when they listen to these two different pairs, two different orders, they also show a kind of we see that's problem, right? This is the high-low order. You hear C and then C. Okay? So their accurate percent is not very high. But when we changed into this C order, just like a non-native speaker did, like me, they might be much better than that. And both Mandarin and English speakers show similar patterns in there. So we found that, I'll go very quickly because I'm running out of time. So we then follow up with a categorical study. We want to make sure that Cantonese native speakers of Cantonese actually can tell C and C apart. They can identify that they do have this category in there for them to enable them to tell the sounds apart. So we designed this categorical perception. And again, Just want to make sure that for that. So they do have this categorical perception in between the C and the C. Oh, sorry. Too quickly. Go back. Yeah. They do have this categorical perception as we expected. They have this category, separate categories for C and the C. Okay. However, when it comes to discrimination, we show that, again, the presentation order within these pairs make a big difference here. Okay? They could not tell the sounds apart very well, the two apart, when we are following this particular high to low order, but their percentage of accuracy was much high when it's low to high order. Okay? So in general, we say that we found this effect of presentation order, this direction, okay, directional asymmetry in even for native speaker of Cantonese. Okay? So it's more like we say this, there must be some kind of non-linguistic reasons behind that. It's more psychoacoustic. People just find that certain sounds, certain properties of the sounds make it more prominent. And make it more salient for us to notice. But of course, there are also native linguistic factors behind this. There's an L1 advantage in there. So Cantonese show a stronger advantage than English and Mandarin, right? So for this from here, we just, as we are actually trying to build a larger data set for the stimuli, we notice that it's not an easy job for us just to simply put this consonants or vowels together or tones together. We have to really consider this effect of presentation order, because in general, people just put things together to say we just balance the order of presentation across the sessions, across the blocks. But actually, see, here's a strong influence of presentation order. If we don't look into this, we might ignore, actually miss the important issues behind it. And also for clinical implication is that we tell the therapist that you might want to start with easily detectable sound pairs when you start training, not starting with those two challenging parts there. Well, I'm just quickly moving to, we'll jump over this here, right? Because, well, a second part of our ongoing project with following this thread is that not only we're working on the speech perception, but also we're using this ultrasound imaging, this technology, trying to understand what exactly is going on with their little tongues inside the mouth. Okay, so here, those are my students over there trying to demonstrating how we use this ultrasound image to show the position or the movement of the tongue here. Well, this is a safe and non-invasive and also kind of user-friendly method for us to track the real-time movement of the tongue. However, these also, you have to be really careful with where that gadget goes, because if you go to the wrong positions, you will not get a very good picture of the tongue. And so we need some kind of practicing. So sometimes you have to really put it in this kind of gadget to make sure it wouldn't move. Well, this is just quickly showing you what we get from these different vowel contexts for T and a da sounds. So you see that in here you can see this is the trajectory of the tongue, okay? Or basically where the tongue is. We're still trying very hard to generate these frame by frame tongue images. Well, the usage, this so-called ultrasound image was actually widely used in helping children with speech sound disorders. For example, in American English, this retroflex sound is considered to be the most challenging issue in children with speech sound orders. Okay, we understand in here, demonstration showing you that when we produce a sound like this, we could either curl up our tongue tip or raise the blade of our tongue. You need to do that, two kinds of gestures. But these ultrasound image have shown that actually in American English, this bunched position is much more prevalent than the so-called tongue tip curl up position. So they are using this so-called video biofeedback method to show children with SSD where their tongue is to help them correct their articulation gestures. And even not only with the children with SSD, but also children with the residual SSD could also be receive benefits from such kind of method. So a child with SSD, if beyond 8 or 9 years old, if they still have the persistent issues, they are called to have residue SSD. Okay? So what you see here is a most recent study, figure from most recent study, so showing us that how children may benefit and what are the issues they have by examining their tongue, using the ultrasound technology to examine their sound, their production. Running out of time, so thank you. All right, so just quickly, I have, we'll just say that research informed method. Actually, I have also received lots of inspiration from my work with these therapists and doctors. Their feedback actually provide me inspiration for my own phonetic study. So I hope that in the future, there's more opportunities to bridge this linguistic and this clinical practices for the benefits of us all. Okay, thank you.